I'm Mo. It is May 8th. No, 9th. Wait, what day is it? I have completed so far one book in May. I completed this book a while ago, but I recently started a new job and it's kicking my butt. So I am a little bit behind on filming and editing and posting, and I'm a little bit behind on reading, but I'm thinking that now that I've been at my new job for a few weeks, I'm really going to be able to get into a better routine. I'm hoping to read more than I did in April and May, and I'm hoping that I will be able to get back to my regular posting schedule. The first book that I read in May, I finished quite a few days ago, I think like 4 or 5 days ago, but I haven't had a chance to talk about it yet, and that is The Baron in the Trees by Italo Calvino. It is translated by Archibald Colquhoun. I will put that in the description below because I have no idea how to pronounce that name. This book takes place in Italy in the 1700s. It was written in 1956, so it is a historical fiction. This book is about a family who is a little bit dysfunctional. The older brother is fed up with the entire family, and the younger brother is kind of just watching all this. He is definitely the most normal out of this family. And when his older brother decides that he is not going to be involved in the family affairs anymore and he is going to live in the trees for the rest of his life, the younger brother is left to tell his story. This book is all about the older brother and how he goes up into the trees and never comes down. He swears that he is never going to set foot on land again. Although he wants to disengage from humanity, he tries to engage with his community and his society. He does eventually become Baron, so he is the Baron in the Trees. He goes on many adventures, all of which he tells his younger brother, and his younger brother writes them in this book. This is told in all sorts of short chapter vignettes of the Baron in the Trees, his adventures. It tells of all the people in their household and what becomes of them. It tells of multiple other characters that the Baron in the Trees meets and what happens to them. A lot of these stories end in tragedy. I like this book. There was a lot of really funny parts, and there was a lot of interesting commentary on why someone would leave society. This book was only 220 pages, but I really think it could have been shorter. There was a repetition to the stories, and there was kind of a downer aspect because the stories mostly didn't end very well. You kind of got excited to read these people's story, and then when it ended in tragedy, you were kind of like, ugh. So then another story you would read, and then you'd be like, ugh. This was one of the first books actually that I learned about on BookTube. Since it is a kind of a modern classic, Italian modern classic, it really got me out of my comfort zone. I'm not used to reading works from other countries as much, and certainly not modern classics from other countries. That was cool to be able to experience kind of different cultures, modern classics. I personally love modern classics, so it's interesting to see how they would differ country to country. There were a bunch of like problematic elements because this book was written so long ago, and there was some death and some gruesome scenes. There was some fighting. There was a hanging. Oh, and there's like a whole sex part too. The way that it was told was in this very story-like, childlike way. I don't know who to recommend this book for, but I did like it. I'm super glad I read it, and it was not really like anything I've ever read before. So that was The Baron in the Trees, and I will catch up with you when I read some more in May. It is May 12th, and I have read another book in May, Confess, Fletch. This is the second in the Fletch books. I got this one after reading Fletch earlier this year. I really liked Fletch. This follows the same investigative reporter, Fletch. Due to circumstances from the first book, he has traveled around the world quite a bit, and he is living in a villa in Italy. In this book, it doesn't really mention too much the previous book, but we do learn about Fletch's past as an art student and art writer. He flies into Boston ostensibly to work on a book about a Boston artist, and the night that he arrives, he goes out of the apartment for a few hours, and when he returns, there is a dead girl in his rented apartment. The person that he's rented the apartment from, he's actually done an apartment swap. So that person is staying in Fletch's villa in Italy, and Fletch is immediately accused of the murder, but suspects that the owner of the apartment is the actual murderer. Fletch meets Flynn, a Irish detective in Boston, and the two strike up a tenuous friendship, especially considering Flynn thinks Fletch is guilty of murder. In the meantime, Fletch is investigating some artworks, again, ostensibly for his book, but really for his fiancée back in Italy. This book was really interesting. Again, it is almost entirely written in dialogue, so almost everything that you get is people talking or Fletch talking, conversations between different people, and there's very little kind of descriptive filler. This one had more than the first book, but this also was a good mystery. It kept me guessing. The first book was made into a movie, so that one I knew the ending to, but this one, of course, I did not know the ending to, and I wasn't sure what the final mystery was going to be. There's a couple of different threads that you can pull and a couple of characters who have interesting backgrounds that you get to find out about, including Flynn, the police investigator. I thought this book was a little weird because they don't mention the first book until like 3/4 of the way through the book. It's not a direct sequel, but it kind of is a direct sequel because the events of the first book directly impact this book. It was odd because in the first book, the things that you learn about Fletch are so much a part of his character, and then in this book, they're not touched on as much, and now we have all this new information about Fletch that we didn't know before. I felt I was waiting the whole time to find out how the two books connected. It almost felt like someone writing a totally different book, but in the same style, and then shoehorning who those characters were. There are some classic Fletch characteristics like dressing up in silly costumes, evading his tails, and going about surreptitiously to different places and events. Although this book kind of threw me a little with its reintroduction of Fletch, it made me want to read the series even more than I already did. So I'm very glad that I got it, and I am very excited to get the next one. Just a note, there are still some very problematic passages in this book. There are still some instances of crude language revolving around women. Also, there is a very weird non-consensual, sort of consensual sex scene, and it's Fletch who's being taken advantage of, and later he refers to it as rape. Very 70s joking about non-consensual sex. Be aware that there is a little bit of that in this book. It's much less than in the first book, and I think overall this book is less problematic, but there are some problematic elements still. I will catch up with you when I read something else in May. It is May 16th, and I have finished one more book in May. I finished this quite a few days ago, but I finished The Loved One by Evelyn Waugh. This is the first Evelyn Waugh I've ever read. I misspoke when I talked about this book before and said that Evelyn Waugh was a bridge between classic and modern classic. That's not true. He was definitely just a modern classic writer from England. This book takes place in California. It is about a group of expats from England who are living in California and working for the movie industry and the movie studios. They hold their British heritage in high regard, and they look down on anyone who is an expat who has turned native. The main character is a poet, and he is starting to go native. So his fellow expats are kind of trying to counsel him to take a different path in life. He decides to work at a pet mortuary, and he is obsessed and enamored of a very high-class person mortuary called Whispering Glades. He goes to Whispering Glades. There he meets a young lady, and they start a relationship. This book was written in 1948, so this is kind of a satire, well, it's definitely a satire of the movie industry, of the studio industry, the relationship of England and America, and how Americans think English people are ridiculous and British people think that Americans are stupid. It is a satire on the business of death and how death can be bought and paid for, and the experience of that, just generally on kind of funeral homes and the emphasis put on how we treat our dead. And it's a kind of weirdly modernistic, semi-dystopian future kind of look at what a funeral would be like and what the business of death would be like in, you know, a kind of alternate, not too distant future from 1948. I didn't know what to expect. I bought this from one of my local used bookstores, and I got it because it was cheap and interesting, and I had heard about Evelyn Waugh but never read anything by him. So I really loved this book. It was so funny, hilariously funny, very dark, very death-centric, and a lot to do with death and dying and the horrors of that and how we cope with the horrors of that, and then also how we deal with failure, the expectations that are put on us by society and by our cultures, and what failure looks like. Highly recommend. Very short, great book. And I will catch up with you when I read some more in May. It is May 22nd, and I have finished 2 more books in May. I've been reading all the Detective Morse stories in order, and I've been listening to them all on audio, read by Kevin Whately. Kevin Whately was the actor who played Lewis, Morse's assistant, in the BBC series. The next book that I read was Death Is Now My Neighbor. The series started in like the 60s or maybe even the 50s, and now we're into the 90s. So everything is kind of getting like more current. But I will say that I think these books are getting less interesting in a lot of ways. I don't know if it's that they kind of follow this formulaic plot. I don't know if it's listening to them on audio, or I don't know if it's them catching up with the times that I'm not thrilled with. Death Is Now My Neighbor sees the plot as a young woman is shot and murdered in her home at point blank range through the kitchen window. Morse and Lewis go to investigate the home. It's on like a cul-de-sac, like little housing development, seemingly a kind of idyllic space. There's a squirrel. Morse is wondering why this young woman, who is, I think, an assistant psychotherapist, was murdered in her home, why she was shot through the window, what about her evoked this crime. What he kind of discovers is that she probably wasn't the main target, and that a person in the same housing development probably was the main target. There's some blackmail. There's the college dean race to the top. Everything in the Morse books kind of ties back to a college atmosphere. So there's, you know, always someone vying for power in the school system. There's always pretty young assistants. When these books started in the 60s, they were just like secretaries, and now they're like executive assistants or whatever in the 90s. The language is kind of coming around and catching up. But I feel like Colin Dexter kind of like, or maybe it's Morse. It doesn't need to be of the present. He needs to be of his time. I think these books like fall into kind of losing a little bit of their essence and their vibe by trying to kind of catch up, by Morse having to use a mobile phone, by the pubs being different, by all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, it doesn't work as well in these later books. Morse is going to be cranky. He's going to meet a hot young thing. They're theoretically going to get together, or at least he's going to like fall in love with her. He's going to do stupid things, and Lewis is going to have to try and redirect him to the right way. Lewis is really going to be the person who makes the correct and vital investigative points, and he's really going to have to find what the problem is. And Morse is more just this kind of aging, ill connector to things. Lewis does the work. And Morse has the imagination. Lewis doesn't have a ton of imagination, so Lewis puts in the work, gets the clues, and then Morse puts them together in various different theories, and Lewis, again, being practical, will knock down a lot of those theories, and then Morse will eventually hit on the theory that is right. So Lewis is the practicality of it, and Morse is the inspired conduit with which these crimes are solved. I think one thing that is reoccurring now in all the Morse books that's a kind of a bummer is not only Morse's alcoholism, but his failing health because of his alcoholism. And I think that through the books, this has been addressed in a way. And even in this book, like, there is a part where he kind of yells at Lewis for asking him to take care of himself better, but then he doesn't take care of himself better. You know, he'll have a scare and then he'll just go back to his ways, which is fine for his character arc and is interesting and you know, definitely portrays that he's not going to get better, and this is eventually going to be his downfall, and that a tiger can't change its stripes. But it also is a little bit frustrating as, like, a reader to kind of have those same things crop up again and again. You know, he's sick with an appendicitis because he doesn't take care of his body, and then he's in hospital, or he's sick with diabetes, or he's sick with this. You just know he's in this eventual and inevitable decline, but in some ways it just feels very repetitive. Death Is Not My Neighbor, not my favorite. It did have an interesting kind of like mistaken identity / blackmail aspect. Maybe I listened to the last one and this one in too close succession, like maybe this was my problem. And in a way I'm glad I own them so that I can go back and listen to them again if I feel like it. But in a way, I like, this one was very forgettable. Like, I barely remember what it was about, which isn't that usual for me. I do love the Morse books. I do love Lewis. I do love Morse, even though he's cantankerous and cranky and not a great person. Now there's 2 squirrels out there. Oh my god. The next book that I read in May is Out of Africa by Karin Blixen, aka Isak Dinesen. I have attempted to read this book before, but I never got through it. I love the movie. I was really happy to complete this book this time. It's quite long for me. It's over 400 pages, which I usually shy away from, but I knew that I loved the subject matter. This memoir is written in a really interesting way. It's written almost in a fictional stylistic manner. This memoir only takes place in Karin's life in Africa. Karin Blixen moves to Africa with her husband, and they plant a coffee plantation in the Ngang Hills, which are close to Nairobi, which is in Kenya. This is kind of pre-Kenya Africa in the beginning of these stories. Her and her husband's relationship is extremely tumultuous. The coffee farm is planted too high in the mountains for coffee to grow really well. World War I breaks out during this time, and she has trials and tribulations with basically every aspect of living in Africa and every aspect of the farm. The kind of story behind Karin Blixen is that she is Swedish via England, and she marries her cousin. Her cousin cheats on her, gives her syphilis. She ends up actually almost dying from syphilis. She goes to Africa for many years, and her husband leaves her. She has this kind of long, drawn-out, dramatic love affair with another Englishman who's living in Africa, and then she is forced to leave Africa and leave everything that she loves about Africa and this place that she really thought was going to be her home and that she thought she was going to die in and live in forever behind, and go back to England. Actually, she's Danish. I said Swedish. She's Danish. Through this book, you get the feeling that she never got over that. She never expected to leave Africa. She never wanted to leave Africa, and having to go back home was a fatal blow to her in some ways, and something that she never got over. This memoir is divided into sections, and the first section is kind of about the people in Africa. She's already established there. She's explaining to the reader kind of about all these people who have meant something to her that live on the farm and work on the farm. It's all about how the farm works and how her house in the farm works, and the things and the trials and the tribulations that she's had to go to. Fires on the farm, having to transport for the government, having to move things, having to sell coffee, having to roast coffee, having to produce it. And then the next part is kind of little vignettes and moments of the farm, little memories that she had, things that she jotted down over her time there or after she left there. And then the ending is kind of the downfall of the farm and how she had to move on from the farm. But this memoir doesn't kind of go into her long history, it doesn't go into her marriage, it doesn't go into her love affair, and it doesn't go into like a day-to-day aspect. It pushes you right into the middle of her story, and through context and through remembrance, you have to understand what's going on. And I think in that way, it becomes an incredibly emotional read, because you're almost reading her diaries, you know, you're almost reading this inner feeling and thought, and this incredibly mindful and thoughtful person who is in this place that is totally alien to her at first, but then becomes so much a part of her that she wonders if she's a part of it. There's this whole part in it where she says, I can't look at the world without Africa the same way. Can Africa look at the world without me the same way? It's just this very like emotional, weirdly powerful book, even though it's very non-linear and it's very one-sided in that you're getting everything from her perspective. I definitely like just cried my eyes out at the end of this book. Her leaving Africa is so moving and tragic and heartbreaking for her, and you just cannot help but read that through her writing. And it just, I mean, I just cried for like hours and hours, but I'm so glad that I did finally read this. I'm excited to watch the movie again. I haven't watched it in many years, and it's actually on one of my subscriptions, so I am gonna watch it, but like I need like an emotional break. Like I need something in between, because this was so emotional for me and I just cried and cried that I know I'm gonna cry again at the movie, and I just like, I'm not there yet. I will be back with you when I read something else. It is May 26th, and I have finished 2 more books in May. I finished World War I British Poets, which is a very short volume of poems all written during World War I. There are 2 female poets, and the rest are all male poets. They're all men who were actually in war, and 1 woman who was in war, and 1 woman who lost their children during the war, or some of their children during the war. These are from famous poets, from unknown poets, from people who are famous only for the poems that they wrote during World War I, or people who are famous, like Thomas Hardy, for other things as well. This was super hard to get through. It was dated, obviously, in kind of poetry and language. The subject matter was really hard to read, and some of it was good and interesting, and some of it was super boring. My favorite part of this book is that they give a little biography of each poet and what they did during the war, or if they survived. So that was really interesting. A lot of people that I'd never heard of. It was cool to read about them. I did kind of mark, I don't know if you can see it, I did like mark some of the poems that I was interested in and that I liked, but ultimately this took me a very long time to get through and was very difficult to read. I'm glad that I read it. I will probably take photos of some of the poems that I really, really liked, and then give this one away at the end of the year. The next book that I finished was The Private Patient by Petey James, and this is the last of the Adam Dalgliesh books, and this is the last book that Petey James wrote before her death. As you know, if you watch this channel, I love Petey James. She's one of my favorite mystery writers, and I love the Adam Dalgliesh mysteries. We follow him from Cover Her Face, which I read earlier this year, which was the first Adam Dalgliesh novel, to The Private Patient. He is a detective, and he kind of climbs through the ranks. We see a little bit of his relationship with his team, his murder squad, and we see a little bit of his relationships outside. Adam Dalgliesh is a poet, and he falls in love with a young woman named Emma. He has kind of a tragic love life. His son and wife died, I think, in childbirth. So when he falls in love with Emma, you know, we as the reader don't see a ton of that. That's not the most important storyline, but we are rooting for them. And in this book, they're going to get married. So he is meeting her father. He's kind of setting up a time when his life won't be murder and the murder squad and being a detective anymore. He's definitely setting up his wedding. He's doing things like putting his right-hand man, who happens to be a woman, up for promotion so that she can become a detective inspector as well and run her own squad. I'm not sure if P.D. James knew this was going to be the last Adam Dalgliesh book, and I'm not sure if she knew this was going to be her last book, but there is a little bit of kind of a wrap-up in it that we do kind of see those steps that Adam's taking to move on with his life. I read this one for the BookTube spin. It was in my intimidating reads section, and I was intimidated by it because it's her last book, and I only have probably a handful of books, maybe 5 books of hers that I haven't read yet, so it's a little bit intimidating to think that, you know, I'm getting to the very end of her catalog and then there will be no more. If I read some more in May, I will check back in with you. It is May 30th, and I have finished one more book in May. It is Nella Larson's Passing. This is a book written in the 1920s. It's part of the Harlem Renaissance, and it's about 2 girls who grow up outside of Chicago in a small town, and the black part of town is very light-skinned. So many of the people in this town have extremely light skin, although they are black, and are able to pass for white. It's about 2 young girls who are friends when they're children, and one of their father dies, and she is taken to the white side of town, and she essentially assumes a white identity. So she only gets to see her friends when she sneaks away, and eventually they stop hearing from her and they don't know what happened to her. Many years later, Irene, who's our main character, is visiting Chicago, and she happens to go to a hotel, and she happens to see this girl who everyone lost track of, Claire, at a hotel. Now, Irene is black. She is able to pass, but she is proud of her racial heritage and she's proud of her race, and so she doesn't pass under normal circumstances. She's married a black man, and she has one child who's light-skinned and one child who's dark-skinned. She does use her ability to pass when it is convenient to her. For instance, at this hotel where she stops to have a drink, she would not normally be admitted if they thought she were black, but because she passes for white, she's able to go on unquestioned and order in the main dining room of the hotel. She meets Claire, and Claire obviously is passing for white, and she's not necessarily proud of her racial heritage and her racial identity. She has married a extremely racist white man, and she is extremely relieved that the one child that they've had also passes for white. This story is about Irene, and it's told partly in flashback. So at the very beginning, you see Irene getting a letter from Claire, and she's kind of reluctant to let Claire back into her life. Then you flash back to them meeting in Chicago and how much it meant to Claire and how much Claire wants to continue that relationship and how much it was disturbing and upsetting to Irene and how little she wants to continue that relationship. So that's kind of the first part of the book. The second part is you are in the present. Irene has this letter and she's deciding and debating whether she's going to let Claire become part of her life and continue a relationship with Claire. So Claire is able to sneak away from her racist husband when he is on business trips. She comes to New York and she does become part of Irene's life. And so there's this kind of like arc of story where the first part where they're re-meeting and reacquainting themselves is told in a very linear, straightforward manner and is very plain and simple and interesting. But then there's this crazy, shocking moment when Irene meets Claire's very, very racist husband, and there's the N-word and there's lots of derogatory language and lots of slurs, and it's very shocking to both the reader and Irene. Irene's like, no way, I'm not doing this. And then there's the rekindling of the relationship later in New York, which again follows a very linear kind of trajectory. And then at the very end, there's another very shocking moment, shocking scene that really catches the reader off guard and again kind of catches Irene off guard. It was fascinating to read. It's only 114, 116 pages. I think now is an amazing time to read it because there is a lot of talk and everything going on about passing and about colorism and about racial identity and how that is defined. Obviously with Britt Bennett's The Vanishing Half, that it is a very, very similar story. I actually mentioned that I read this to a friend and she was like, that sounds like the exact plot to the vanishing half. So I'm super interested to read that. So those were all the books that I read in May. Passing was the last book that I read. I thought I might finish something else, but I did not. So there you go. It was a really interesting reading month. I started off the month with an Italian modern classic that also happens to be a historical fiction. That also has to be magical realism or speculative fiction. And I read this for Linguathon. You can see my Linguathon vlog. That's been up for a while, and I will link it in the comments below. I read some nonfiction this month. I read a book of poems, and I read a memoir. I read some more speculative fiction, some more magical realism, a satire this month. I read several mysteries, my favorite genre. So I read one from the 2000s, one from the 70s, and I also read another in the Morse series from the 90s. I read one literary fiction, Passing by Nella Larson. I read mostly physical books as usual and one book on audio. I was really happy with the diversity I have. I have some British authors, which is normal. I read an Italian author, which is very, very rare for me. Italo Calvino is Italian and Cuban, so I think that counts as Latinx as well. I read a Danish author, and I read a few American authors like Gregory MacDonald and Nella Larson. Nella Larson is a Black female author. Last month in April, I didn't read any nonfiction, so I feel good about the nonfiction that I read this month. I read a bunch of books for my 1900 to 1950 readathon vlog, which will be coming soon. This was a really fun readathon that, again, pushed me out of my comfort zone. I had to read things that I normally wouldn't read, and it was really a fun time. I read my booktube spin book this month, and I will have a vlog out about that later as well. I continued a few series that I really enjoy. Overall, I'm really happy. I read 8 books in May, which is more than I read in April, which was one of my goals for this month. April was definitely a down, and I feel like May is on the up, so I'm excited about that. If you haven't checked out my summer TBR, go check that out. Have you ever read any of the books that I read here? What was your favorite book that you read in May? What was the book that took you most out of your comfort zone? I think for me, it actually ended up being World War I British poets. I wasn't a huge fan of this, but I was glad to learn more about the genre, and it was something that I might not have otherwise read. I hope you had a great reading month, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye!